Gifford. Further to my left, beside Mike Henry, member QC and member of the National Council of Reparations, Jamaica. I apologize for the absence of Minister Olivia Grange, Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, who has responsibility for reparations, but she is unable to be with us this morning. She sends her best wishes. So on behalf of the Center for Reparations Research at UWI, host of the press conference and public education forum, I extend a warm welcome to all media houses present here in the council room at UWI, as well as those who have joined us by live stream provided by UWI TV and on social media. Permit me to say a little bit about the center. The Center for Reparations Research at the University of the West Indies was established in 2017 at the directive of the heads of government of CARICOM at the 34th meeting of CARICOM heads of government in July 2013. The idea for the center emerged out of the need to support the CARICOM and the national and global reparatory justice movements, build awareness, engage in advocacy, and conduct research which would advance the claim to Europeans of various forms of reparation for native genocide, African enslavement, deceptive indentureship, colonialism, and its legacies. In addition to supporting the pursuit and implementation of CARICOM's reparatory justice program, the CRR is primarily motivated by two other interlocking objectives: to broadly foster awareness around the lasting and adverse consequences of colonialism in the Caribbean, and offer practical solutions to halting and reversing them. Both these objectives grow out of an understanding that many of the injustices and adverse effects of colonialism in the Caribbean did not end with formal independence and still need to be addressed and repaired. In keeping with its mandate, the Center, in collaboration with the CARICOM Reparations Commission, is hosting now the second press conference since our establishment. Hopefully, those of you from the media will carry our message through your news stories and help to generate public interest in a matter that is not confined to the past, but which has current application. The matter at hand is certainly not confined to the past. You will soon hear how an error-filled tweet from Her Majesty's Treasury has created a firestorm among citizens of the UK and the Caribbean, who woke up on February 9 to learn that they had contributed through their taxes to the enrichment of financial institutions and the descendants of the planter class. So when British politicians declare that Caribbean people should not peer into the past, but move on from a distant, irrelevant past, we now have to say, not so fast. We have learned that after the financial crash in 1720 called the South Sea Bubble, the British government was forced to undertake a bailout that eventually left several million pounds of debt on its books. Almost 3 centuries later, Britons are still paying interest on a small part of that obligation. Prompted by record low interest rates, the British government announced a few years back that it would pay off some of the debts it racked up over hundreds of years, dating as far back as the South Sea Bubble. George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, said last December that in 2015, Britain would repay part of the country's debt from World War I, and that he wanted to pay off other bonds for debt incurred in the 18th and 19th centuries. That includes borrowing that may have been used to compensate enslavers when African enslavement was abolished, to relieve the famine in 19th century Ireland, and to bail out the infamous South Sea Company, which caused the bubble in 1720. And as Stephen Castle said in the New York Times of December 27, 2014, and I quote, "The maneuver is also a reminder of how debts incurred by governments are passed down through generations," end of quote. That is only part of the conundrum. Our panelists will say more about what is the implication of this maneuver with respect to the compensation money for the reparation movement. What did Prime Minister Cameron know about this when he came to the region in 2015? So let me now outline how we will proceed. Each panelist will have 7 to 10 minutes to make an opening statement, And I think I have a timekeeper in the room that will indicate to me when time is up. We will start with the chair of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. We will follow that with Minister Henry and then Lord Anthony Gifford, and then we will open the floor to questions from the media. So, Chair, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. When CARICOM established the CARICOM Reparations Commission, the mandate given to this commission was to facilitate ongoing research to establish the evidentiary basis for the claims of reparations for the crimes committed against the people of the Caribbean. The commission was established against the background of the United Nations conference that took place in Durban, South Africa in 2001, where the United Nations declared that the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of African peoples constitute crimes against humanity. Since the commission has been established, there have been a number of developments, including the mandated creation of a Center for Reparations Research at the University of the West Indies. This was mandated by the heads of governments, and the university has implemented that request. As you all know, Professor Shepherd is the director of the Center for Reparations Research. Since the United Nations Conference at Durban, Britain and other European nations have argued that they will not and cannot apologize for the crimes committed against the African people. And they have set out a number of arguments as to why they will not apologize. One of the arguments that they have used is that slavery and the slave trade were legal activities because they had deemed them to be legal. And to the extent that they had deemed these activities legal, no crime was committed. The second argument used by Britain and other European nations was that in any event, slavery and the slave trade were a long time ago, belonging to the distant past, and therefore not subject to any form of political, diplomatic, or legal settlement. The people of the Caribbean have been arguing from the very beginning that these crimes do not belong to the distant past, that these are contemporary crimes and therefore subject to impartial justice. The conversation has been going on within the United Nations and in other environments as to how best to proceed. There was a perception that in the conversation there has been a stalemate between the claims of the Caribbean that these are present-day crimes because there are households and families in this region that have memories of these crimes and are living the legacies of these crimes today, and the European and British position that they belong to the historical past. On the 30th of September 2015, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Mr. Cameron, visited the Caribbean and spoke in the Jamaica Parliament. In his presentation to the Jamaica Parliament, his thesis was clear. Slavery is in the past. Let's forget it. Let's move on. The people of the Caribbean should get over it. And that there is no benefit to either side or to humanity by addressing this matter in a formal sense. In other words, the position of the British government was that they have moved on, and they have long moved on from this matter. And he has urged the Jamaican people and the Caribbean people and the African people on the whole and humanity in general that this is in the past and this should move on. The research, however, has now shown that the Prime Minister of Britain, in making this presentation to the Parliament of Jamaica and the people of the Caribbean, that his thesis was deceptive. It was deceptive in the sense that it is not true. And to the extent that the thesis represented untruths, it is important for us to say why this is so. The evidence now shows that the £20 million which the British government borrowed on the capital market and was financed by the Rothschilds merchant banking system, that loan was not repaid until the 1st of February 2015. That for 180 years, the British government has been repaying the slavery loan. When Prime Minister Cameron spoke in the Jamaica Parliament, he was aware that the Bank of England and the Treasury Department were still paying those persons who held the bonds on the slavery loans. And to that extent, therefore, the people of Great Britain and the British state were still repaying the slavery loan, which means that this transfer of public money to the private holders of the slave bond makes it a present-day activity. It also implies that the some 300,000 West Indian people who have been living in Britain in the last 70 years or so, like my own parents who worked in Britain for 40 years, and over 200,000 Jamaican people who have been living in Britain in recent years, that their taxes were being used to pay back the slavery loan, which would suggest then that we are speaking about a double payment. The people in Britain in general, and the West Indians in particular, are extremely concerned that their taxes today were being used to pay back the holders of the slavery bonds. We consider this to be an immorality. We consider this to be duplicity and public dishonesty. For me, it is the greatest act of political immorality in my time that we have been told consistently and persistently that this matter is in the past, that we have moved on, get over it, and yet Her Majesty's Treasury has released the relevant information suggesting that it is just 3 years ago that this bond has been repaid. Many of you might be aware that I have spoken in the British House of Commons about this matter shortly before. And the question I had to ask myself, is there a relationship between the address which I gave in the House of Commons and the decision by the British government to close off this loan? But I think it's important for all of you here and for the world in general to understand the significance of this in terms of numbers. You might very well think that the £20 million the British government raised in 1835 to begin to compensate the slave owners, having decided that the enslaved people will receive no compensation, the slave owners will receive compensation, that this is a small amount of money. Allow me to give you 3 ways in which you can calculate the enormity of this amount of money. Firstly, the £20 million in 1835, the value of that money today is £15 billion. That is the value of that money today, £15 billion. In 1835, when that money was borrowed and handed over to the slave owners, that £20 million represented 40%. That £20 million represented 40% of national public expenditure. In other words, it represented 40% of the national budget. And you can imagine, therefore, what 40% of a national budget would constitute. It was an enormous amount of money. Just under half of the national budget was calculated and handed over to the slave owners. If you consider what 40% of national expenditure in the British economy at that time, to give you another calculation, 40% of the British economy today, 40% of the British economy today would be £240 billion. It would be 240 billion pounds would be the sum you would be looking at if you had to make that payment today, given the size of the economy. So do not think for a moment that this amount of money was a small amount of money. It was an enormous sum of money that almost bankrupted the British economy. And let me tell you how that was calculated, because I want to explain that this is pure economics in action. The abolition of slavery was not a moral and political conversation. It was economics in action. And let me explain to you the economics of that legislation. The British government decided that all of the black people in the Caribbean they owned, their replacement value or their capital value was £47 million. So the some 600,000 Africans, our ancestors who they owned in the Caribbean, their commercial value was £47 million. And that this amount of money should go to the slave owners once slavery is abolished. The British government decided that they were not going to pay the slave owners the £47 million, but they will pay them £20 million instead. But having decided to pay them £20 million instead of the full sum, which was £47 million in value, they designed an Emancipation Act that said we will pay $20 million to the owners of slaves, but the slaves themselves would have to work off the remaining 27 million. And so they passed an act that said you are free. The slaves are now free. The black people are now free. But you have to work for free for another 6 years. And they call that the apprenticeship. So you have to work for 6 years for free to the people who own you to work off the remaining 27 million. So 20 in cash was handed over and 27 million in, no, I'm going to explain this very carefully. 27 million will be worked off in free labor, thus accounting for the 47 million. Understood? The implication of that, therefore, is that the Africans paid the majority of the money for their own freedom, because they gave 27 million in free labor and the 20 million in cash that was paid over. So the Africans paid more than the British government to get their own freedom. The British government, therefore, could not say, as it did over the decades, oh, we have freed the Africans. The Africans paid more than half of the sum of money to achieve their own freedom. The British government, therefore, decided to use the Haiti model. The French had done the same thing to the Haitians. You fought and won your freedom, now you have to pay for it. The economic value of the 300,000 Africans in Haiti, their economic worth on the market, on the capital market, they were worth 150 million francs. The Haitian government had to pay that money back to the French government. So the Haitians had to pay for their freedom by paying their own capital value. Every Haitian was given a market value based on your age, your sex, your skills, your color. You were given a market value, a tradable value. That value was paid to the French government. The British implemented a similar strategy, but worse, because at least in the case of the French, the Haitians were paying the French until 1947. From 1825 to 1947, the British were worse. That the people were paying now from 1835 to 2015. Now, it is important, therefore, to realize that the British have been more exploitative of the people of the Caribbean in this instance than even the French, who we had demonized for what they did to Haiti. The British upped the ante and repaid this loan even much longer. The significance of all of this for us today in the Caribbean is that this compensation legislation and the legal instrument they used, which was an annuity, an open-ended annuity and bond, it allowed the British government to refinance that loan time and time again. And this is what the British have been doing. They have been refinancing the slave loan. Each time the British economy got into trouble, they reopened the slave loan, borrowed more money against it, got the cash, reinvested in the economy, and kept going. And there have been several refinancing of this slave loan up until the present time. The last big refinancing was 1927. Almost 100 years later, the British reopened the slave loan, refinanced it, because the economics at the time was that the British economy was in trouble because of the global recession. John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, said, the government needs to spend on capital works, build roads and bridges, and spend the economy out of recession. But they had no cash. So where are they going to get the cash to invest in public works to spend the economy out of recession? They reopened the slave loan and borrowed the money against the slave loan to get the cash to reinvest in the economy to drive Britain out of recession. These are the issues that we have to fully understand.
So that when we are talking about slavery and emancipation and reparations, we're not talking about morality and politics only. We are talking about the economics of transformation and development. And finally, why did Britain choose this model of emancipation? Britain chose this economic model of emancipation in order to transfer the wealth out of the Caribbean back to Britain. The British economists were very clear in 1830. The Caribbean economy has no future for us. Our future is industrial development at home. We do not have the cash to invest in industrial development. And remember, 1825, the railway industry is now invented. The first railways are now being built. Britain is going to connect all of the towns and cities and villages by railways and establish a modern infrastructure. Where are they going to get the cash? Liquidate the slave cash. Liquidate the slavery, emancipate the slaves, take the money out of the Caribbean and invest that money in British industrial development. And that was brilliant economics from their perspective. This is really what has happened. So Britain becomes a modern industrial nation using the cash liquidated from slavery. So here we are today looking at poverty in the Caribbean. Britain giving independence to these countries and telling them, you are now independent, go away. Leaving this enormous burden of poverty in the Caribbean. A large number of people, massive illiteracy, massive ghettoization, massive unemployment, industries that are not competitive, agriculture that is not modern. And Britain says, after extracting all of this wealth, go away and develop. Our argument has been all along that Britain owes the Caribbean a development program. After 500 years of wealth extraction, and particularly this notorious slave loan that has been extracting wealth out of the Caribbean until 2015, Britain has a moral and legal obligation to put this money back in the Caribbean for the development of the Caribbean peoples. And this is what we have been saying in the reparations movement. Britain and Europe needs to return that money to the Caribbean that they have extracted, and now we have proof of even greater extraction into 2015 of the slave loan. So we now have a major moral issue. And finally, I wish to say this. The people of the Caribbean need to take a stand on this matter. The development discourse in the world today is that Caribbean states are failed states. Your poverty is increasing, your inequality is increasing, your economies are collapsing more and more because you are incompetent, you cannot manage your own affairs, and you are the result of intellectual failure. The counter-argument to that is no. The counter-argument to that is no. That the wealth that has been extracted out of this region and continues to be extracted has systematically impoverished the Caribbean, and the Caribbean will not go forward until this process is reversed. So we are persistently and consistently the victims of this extraction of wealth, and we have a right to say, Europe, Britain owes this region a development model that returns that investment to the Caribbean. And that has to be the position we have to take. At a personal level, all of us should take this matter personally, because I'm sure all of us have family and friends who have been working in Britain in the last 70 years. And just to imagine that your family, my family, working in Britain, in the factories, on the buses, on the trains, their taxes have been used to pay the slave owners until 3 years ago. It's a great act of global immorality, and it has to be addressed. And the CARICOM Reparations Commission will be indeed urging the governments of the Caribbean to insist that this information is once again placed before the governments of Europe, because the reparations conversation must now take place in earnest. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And for those who want to know more about the CARICOM's 10-point action plan for repatriate justice and the development model, you have it in your press kit. May I just ask Minister Mike Henry to make his brief remarks.
Thank you very much. It is working. Let me first put myself in perspective here, that I'm not here as minister, I'm here as Citizen Henry. And therefore I speak as Citizen Henry against the background of my historic approach to this matter. Having recognized long ago it was the greatest economic crime ever foisted on the world, I think that can be supported by the fact that they used a plant named the banana to build a whole continent. I've spoken to those things, and I've spoken in my book, Many Rivers to Cross, where I am on this matter. And time being of the essence. What I'm here today is to enjoin support for my position that we take the Queen to her own court on the economic crime against humanity as a first step. Have that her own court decide on her failing to protect what she was building as an empire, and demand a decision which then relates to the fact that where we go from there in terms of what is a compensation for the duplicity and the deception is eminently produced in the presentation early. And the research continues to be able to provide the supporting mechanisms that would make an argument in our own court. But having recognized all of this in my lifetime, I fought through 5 successive governments to still be able to claim reparations. And I've ended up here today feeling dissatisfied but satisfied. Because I remind everyone I boycotted Parliament. I boycotted that great insult, adding insult to injury, by the then British Prime Minister, David Cameron, who ended up speaking in the highest court of the land and deceiving us, as I would have expected anyway, as he's a product of the plantocracy and the ownership of the slaves. Therefore, I'm not surprised by any of this. The deception continues, and the delay also leaves behind a whole generation that, as the Vice Chancellor said, is evident to us. So beside adding insult to injury, and beside the lifetime fight, one analysis that I came, because of the steps in which I have been advocated, and in my book, Many Rivers to Cross, records all the speeches I've made over all the times it fell off the order paper of the House as a private member's motion. Because my only discovery is driven by the fact that we fail at all times to make a political decision on what we as the politicians should be fighting for the people. And without the political decision, no citizen, no one, if you fail with the aspect of taking the Queen to her own court, I really know anyone could find against us on the basis of the evidence that's being produced, and I'll speak to some. On the basis of the fact that if not after that, you go to the next stage, because you'll be taking her on the basis of the economic crime first. Then you go afterwards for the other areas of abuse, all the areas that we know are the moral failure of Great Britain to her colonies. In that context, therefore, you need the political decision, and I got a unanimous decision in Parliament that we should claim reparations, and my clearest statement was on the economic exploitation as evidenced by the presentation. Therefore, I do not see a delay, and I therefore need the support to move forward on the basis of the fact that there is no doubt in anybody's mind that this was an economic investment. And when you introduce, and the research can clarify me because I'm merely a layman, but I believe chattel slavery, and I re-emphasize that, because they're hidden under the aspect that slavery is a way of life. Chattel slavery, as far as this layman knows, was only practiced in 7 or 8 countries in this region. It is known anywhere else. And once you introduce chattel slavery, it was part of the deception of what was slavery and the abuse of human rights. On the basis of that, I had long gone ahead and drafted a petition for reparation, which I can now take the Queen to her own Privy Council, on the basis that the Section 4 of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council Act 1933, the head of state of Jamaica for the United Kingdom of Great Britain is the Queen. There's the overwhelming majority of the population of Jamaica are descendants of persons who have been forcibly taken for their home in Africa without their consent, deported to Jamaica en masse, sold to work under participants in slavery under British colonial rule under manumitted by the United Kingdom government of 1838. That the ancestors were victims of the crime against humanity under British colonial rule that lasted for 300 years, when the island was captured from the Spanish to the termination of colonial rule in 1962, is historically clear. The crimes committed on the petitioners and the ancestors were perpetrated by the authority of the United Kingdom at London. All of these issues, as we go through 12 generations of manipulation of the petitioners' ancestors, were clear, and ending up in that great insult once again of a British Prime Minister who owns family-owned slaves, coming here to address us in the very highest level of our decision-making of the land. I'm saying that the Jamaican people are entitled to reparation from the government of the United Kingdom from the crimes committed against them and their ancestors. And in order that reparation should be carried out as restorative justice, where the movement of the UK and representatives of the people of Jamaica address the aftermath of the offense. Further going ahead in terms of the petition and looking at it, which has to be now enjoined by a British legal firm, there are many approaches that have to be taken in relation to that. An approach to the petition could be that at relevant times the slaves that receive compensation is balanced, and I've worked out all the issues that can be addressed. I'm fully aware, and I wrote in my book, the areas of excuse of what is the benefits that where we would get to if there had to be a judgment on restorative costs. I'm sure the British would be telling me that they've given me a language. Well, I am prepared to concede that an economic language of the word is English, but I'm therefore also prepared to concede that the basis of taking away a language of a country is an abuse of human rights. But if so you value it, you take it off the bottom line. Just as I strongly stand for repatriation in terms of whatever comes out of the claim that I am still continuing to pursue, and is evidenced by correspondence that is as before me in terms of another approach and issues that can be argued in court, which were given me to my hand by a British legal firm only 2 days ago. I'm still waiting on the government to begin, and I have enhanced that the Minister of Justice should begin to really take a stand on this matter in relation to it, because I do not think the research can only strengthen our case. The research can only add the fact that makes it stronger in court. So I'm asking the Reparations Committee to enjoin, because I am prepared now to move on the basis of the finality of the issues that are before us. And if indeed I was unsuccessful before the Queen's own court, people say that's an impossible fight to win, then of course, having made a political decision by a government and the Parliament, then we could proceed to also go to International Court of Justice. We could then add all the other issues which are relevant. Because there is a kind of fear, and I think former Prime Minister Cameron was playing on that, you know, that basically by asking for reparations, you're being a mendicant. Well, I wanted to be very clear that that is something that I am going to put aside, because the economic crime, ladies and gentlemen, Harry Belafonte sings of 6-hand, 7-hand, 8-hand bunch. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't in the declining numbers or the increasing numbers. It was how you had to pack the bananas in the boat. And if you packed the 9-hand too early at the bottom, then the bananas would ripen before they get to England. and therefore the sale would not be the same and the income not the same. I say these things in the simplicity of my own experience and my own approach to this overall. But I believe the time has long passed for us to be merely continuing to build the case, which I know is fully built, because we did hear about who do you pay. I have said in my book that you pay to whoever is the government of Jamaica. That for me is an insult itself to the governments, as if every government merely wastes the opportunity and that you would know to handle the money which they're protecting for their own cause and their own claim. They have said, who are the descendants? I've done my own research on myself, and I would like to claim the descendancy of the Igbos, so I'm a Red Igbo. But many people might think, am I a descendant or part of the plantocracy? And the plantocracy still exists in terms of our development of our country right now. I can attach that easily to crime. Crime didn't matter until it came above halfway tree. The reality relates to it overall. Having lived long enough, I can speak with some degree of strength of my observation of my country. And in that context overall, I am continuing, and I hope the Committee for the Center of Reparations Research, I think I've presented before the petition case. If you haven't got it, I was certainly prepared by Frank Phipps QC. I think I can now provide the support of the British legal firm that is willing to move forward and who has given me further thoughts, which is only a month old, of where to proceed. I don't want it to think, and I was told when I brought the first petition to Parliament, I was advised by Prime Minister Bruce Golding that it wouldn't have passed the first time because I should enjoin CARICOM. I made that fall off the order paper, waiting for that, brought it back, and I know how difficult it is for private members' motions to cross or to be able to be achieved. I think I was able to succeed for that after some 25 years of trying. The political decision has been made, and I think it has been made by other countries in the CARICOM. I therefore felt that it isn't something that we should tie to all the other issues, and every one of which I agree with, because nobody can replace that exploitation of man's inhumanity to man as rested in the Middle Passage. But I also pride myself in thinking that the only way I can beat the Anglo-Saxon is to understand his game and play it in that context. I hope I've not taken up more time than I should, because I should be at my ministry now, but this is quite important to me. But I thought I would just put that in perspective. I don't know how much of the crowds I would get with all the eminent learned people in terms of it here if I called one. But I am not giving up the fight, and that's as up to date as 3 weeks ago. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I congratulate the research section and approach and all that has been done. And therefore, I want to move on now. I always say beginning and end, I'm an older man in a hurry, so I want it done in my lifetime. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you very much. For reparation advocates to whom we look for all kinds of information and advice. And Stephen Golding is here. He's a member of the National Council on Reparation. He knows, along with Lord Anthony Gifford, another member of the commission, the council, that we have, Muta is here. Hi, Muta, another member of the council. So the council has taken on the petition, and those of us who are into research, we are providing what QC Phipps asked us for, because he's working very hard. I think the next step is that it has to go to the Attorney General. So that's where we're told by Frank Phipps that it has reached. So congratulations, and we go full speed ahead. Let me now ask Lord Anthony Gifford to make his brief remarks before asking the press to pose their questions.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. First of all, can I welcome the founding quite recently of the Center for Reparation Research. It's another one of those milestones which have been taking place for over the last 10 years in particular. I don't think anybody 10 years ago could have imagined how much has been achieved over these 10 years, and it's just the beginning. This center comes after the fact that now all over the Caribbean there are national commissions or councils on reparation. Jamaica led the way in 29 by the starting of the first Reparations Commission. There has been the resolution in Parliament, the only place in the Caribbean where a parliamentary resolution sponsored, pushed for by our friend, my friend, Mike Henry. Congratulations to him for getting through the Parliament unanimously a resolution which resolved that the House debate the issue and make a political decision that the government of Jamaica is entitled to receive payment from Great Britain. That was another milestone. The Caribbean itself has a Reparations Commission of which Hilary Beckles is chair. And it's not just people at the top, people, the intellectuals or the activists or the politicians who are taking part. The youth are taking part as well. Because in my mind, the strength of the reparations movement will depend on the strength of the popular mobilization. Because leaders can only do so much. Leaders are under pressure, particularly on an issue as sensitive as this. And it is only when there is support from the people as a whole. And Stephen Golding here has been one of the dynamos of the recent Relay for Reparations, which went all around Jamaica, taking in the school students, who I have now listened to, as I wrote in a letter to the Observer yesterday. I listened to, and I felt their enthusiasm and their interest, and they are the future of this movement. So I really welcome the center. Just as an idea of what the challenge you have to meet is this. When in 1996 I introduced a debate into the House of Lords, which I was then a member of, not anymore, on reparations for slavery, the government speaker said, quote, "The case for reparations for slavery rests on the premise that the effects of slavery are still being felt on Africans now living in Africa and the diaspora. There is no evidence of that. That is the challenge. We all know, everyone in this room knows of the evidence of our own experience, the psychological, the physical, the poverty, the disease. It's echoed in the 10-point plan of CARICOM, but I think it needs research, continual research and expertise to make that link, which to some people is not as obvious as it is to us, some people particularly in the UK. So I wanted to give you this morning the view of a dual citizen. I, of course, was born British. I've been a Jamaican citizen since 1995. And I can well understand, perhaps more than most people in the UK, the outrage that is felt about a tweet coming out of the Treasury a few days ago on the 21st of February. Let me just read it to you. HM Treasury. Here's today's surprising Friday fact. Millions of you helped end the slave trade through your taxes. Now, is this a sick joke? Or is it a piece of propaganda, a skillful piece of propaganda, attempting to foster this notion, which is very prevalent in parts of Britain, that somehow Britain was the benefactor in all this? We were the first to abolish the slave trade, said one of the lords in that debate that I told you about. Interestingly, in the gallery with me was the famous historian, Jamaican historian, Richard Hart. He passed a message down to me. He said, it wasn't Britain actually who were the first, it was the Danes. I got that into the debate. But there's a mentality which is very strong and which is being echoed now, particularly in the Brexit debates, that Britain somehow was a benefactor. You helped end the slave trade. Of course, factually, it's nonsense. The slave trade ended in 1807. This financing of the planters happened in 1837. So that the taxpayers didn't help end the slave trade, but it's trying to foster that notion that we are the virtuous ones. We British are the virtuous people. It's like a man who's been beating his wife for 20 years and stops, says, look at me, I've stopped beating my wife. I don't do it anymore. Well, the wife is still scarred. and psychologically damaged and showing the signs of the injuries which are not then treated or compensated for by the husband and his friends. So that there is, of course, another part of Britain. Britain is not monolithic. We can't just talk about all British people as some kind of bloc that is going to fight reparations. I was privileged to be part of a delegation led by Professor Shepherd to UK in November last year. And we went to meetings in London, in Birmingham, and in Liverpool. And we met grassroots activists from many sections, mostly African, Afro-British, but intensely committed to the reparations cause. We also had a large meeting of lawyers, human rights lawyers, who pledged their support. And we know that there's not only the British politics are not only represented by Theresa May and her present, and David Cameron and the present lot. There is another kind of British politics represented increasingly in the Labour opposition, and which is increasingly rallying and gathering the more decent side of British people who don't want to see laws just for the rich and not for everybody. So this tweet, to me, was an insult. I'm glad that we are fighting it, but you see, the reparations claim is very uncomfortable for many people in Britain because it puts the whole vocabulary of the connections between Britain and the Caribbean in a different context. At the moment, they like to think they're giving us aid. They're helping us develop because we can't do it on our own. They're being generous to us. The truth is the opposite. What is paid in the form of aid is only a fraction of the debt which is owed from Britain to the Caribbean. The reparations demand is a demand for justice. It is not, as Sir Hilary said, some kind of begging act. They like to think of us as beggars. We need to stand up for our rights. Get up, stand up for our rights, because it is a matter of justice. Chattel slavery, as Mike Henry told you, was the greatest crime against humanity. And a crime against humanity, and it wasn't even legal at the time. I can read you the judgment of Lord Mansfield in 1775 in the Somerset case, where he talked about the odious nature of slavery. Let me just read one sentence to you, if I may, Ms. Moderator, to show that slavery was not legal in England. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political. It's odious, so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it. I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged. And that was the case of an African who had been taken to Britain and whose owner wanted to take him back to Jamaica. So I am very hopeful. I've seen many causes which people thought were hopeless triumph. I think there's no limitation period for crimes against humanity. Once it is clear that the damage that was done by this crime still it still persists. It not only persists in the damage, psychological and economic, which is done to our people here. It also persists in the sickness of racism in Britain. To me, I would like to add to the 10-point plan a condition that the British government and other European governments change their view of history, change the education they give to their children, get away from this rule Britannia, Britannia rules the ways mentality, because the truth is that there was a crime committed treating people as property, which is unique. It's nothing like the slavery, the different forms of slavery that existed in other parts of the world. I'm glad we are here, and let this movement continue, because the surge of the tide is going our way, and we will be able to get reparatory justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Tony, just to add that in looking at the tweet, I agree with you about the errors, but I think we should add that it wasn't even 1807, Lord Anthony Gifford, because between January 1, 1808 and the 17th of February, 1808, 16 ships with enslaved Africans arrived in Jamaica with 4,000 enslaved Africans. And those ships could have been ordered back. They had barely left Liverpool at the time of the act. So, thank you. The floor is now open for members of the media. I'm starting with the media who would like to pose a question, make a comment. Please state the name of your media house as you approach the mic. I think we have a roving mic. So I think we have, I would say, 20 minutes to go.
Hi, good morning. We have some questions from our online audience, so I'm just going to read them out. So what can we do as individual citizens of CARICOM to fight for reparations? What leverage do we have over the UK and the Commonwealth to fight for what is ours? We have another question. The latest polling out of Britain says that the Brits are proud of their colonialist past and think nothing of it. Why does the panel think there is hope for reparations, given Parliament largely will do what the people want?
You have another one?
That's it.
Okay, and we have one here from the Gleaner.
Thanks. Romario Scott, editor at The Gleaner. Can you explain Queen's Counsel, Mike Henry, the Honourable, had said that it is possible to sue the Queen, but based on our interpretation of the 1947 Act, it is impossible to sue the Queen. However, you can take the government to court, but not the Queen herself. Could we get some clarity on that particular issue?
Okay, so I will stick with these four for now and ask the panelists. Chair of CARICOM, maybe the first one. What can we do as citizens of CARICOM? Number two, Lord Anthony Gifford. Britain is very proud of her colonies. Parliament will do what citizens want. How do we move the British Parliament to act when the people are thinking one way? And then I guess,
Okay.
Mike, maybe the one about the petition, but let the chair start, the chair of CARICOM.
Thank you. Well, first, let us focus here. The reason we have called this press conference was to place historical and contemporary information in the public space about the present circumstance. This is why we are here to look at the significance of that. For the last 3 years, a number of scholars have been going through the archives of the Bank of England, the Rothschilds Financial Corporation that syndicated the slave loan, and the archives of Her Majesty's Treasury. These scholars, led by Professor Chris Manchapra, Professor Chris Manjapra, Manjapra, who is professor at Tufts University. He has been leading this research project with our support to get to the bottom of this matter. And he was the one who unearthed all of this information showing that the British government had been refinancing this loan and paying back this loan, and finally, in a jerk-knee reaction, paid it off on the 1st of February 2015 after 180 years. When British officials realized that the information had to be made available under the Public Information Act that gives scholars the right to pursue research in archives, and when this information became available and was being discussed, it was at that stage that Her Majesty's Treasury took a decision not only to admit it, but to say, yes, we have been given direction to the Bank of England to pay off this money into the present time. The significance, as I said, of this is that it defeats the argument that successive British prime ministers have been given. Tony Blair, at the UN conference in 2001, sent a delegation to say, slavery's in the past, forget it, let's move on. Prime Minister Cameron comes to Jamaica, slavery's in the past, forget it, let's move on. Yet both of those prime ministers were given instruction to pay off the slavery loan and to keep it quiet. But the researchers have found it, and when the Treasury realized that we were onto this information, and I wish to give thanks to Professor Chris Manjapra for leading this research. In fact, even before the tweet came out from Her Majesty's Treasury, at one of our meetings of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, we were alerted and we discussed that this information is now available to us. We have access to this information. It means, of course, that 1835 has now come right into our lives. It's our issue. All of us in this room, all of us in this world, this is now our issue. Not history, this is today. And I want you to imagine it. Instruction from the Minister of Finance to the Bank of England to release the funds to pay the bondholders their cash in relation to the slavery loan of 1835. Today, taxpayers' money, your money, my money, all of us who have worked in England, Lord Gifford's money, Lord Gifford's taxes. He was the one who spoke in the House of Lords about this crime, but his taxes were being paid to people who probably were some of his friends. At that time, and we don't know. And that's the irony of it. We have the list of the banks and all of the people. Yes. The banks are all there. All of these banks who held these bonds, these slavery bonds. Barclays Bank, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Lloyds Banks, Morgan Stanley, all of these major entities, JP Morgan, all of these banks, Royal Bank of Canada, all of them owning slave bonds. The slave bonds of 1835, they own those bonds today. It's not a historical issue. This is not history. This is about our lives today. What can we do? It's all a question of how much pride you have in your own life, your own time, how much pride you have as a citizen, as a descendant, as an African, how much pride you have, how you feel about what has happened to your ancestors, your parents, your foreparents. How do you feel about all of that, yourselves? And when you're told that the reason you're poor is because you're not smart, you're poor because you can't manage your affairs, you're poor because you are failed citizens in failed countries. You're not poor because all of the wealth have been extracted from you and you're left to scrape the barrel with what's left. You're poor because of this history that has come right into the present time. When Jamaica became independent in 1962, only 70% of Jamaican people could read or write. And that is after 300 years that Britain owned this island, leaving you with 3/4 of your people can't read or write and say, go and develop. This is a great immorality, and I believe it has to be addressed not only at the level of diplomacy, but as Minister Henry says, this is a legal case that has to be addressed and addressed forcefully for the future. This 21st century is going to be very long. We are here at the beginning of it, and the war has already started against us. You only have to listen to American politics and global politics. The war is against us. This is a long century ahead of us. We have to get our act together right now to deal with this. Otherwise, the next 50, 60 years, we have no future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So let me ask if there are any other members of the media who want to ask a direct question on the topic of the press conference about the loan that was paid off in 2015. Lord Anthony Gifford. Yes, I know.
No, you go.
Yes. Quickly, and then I think we have one question there. Yes.
I think 2 questions came in my direction. The first is, I read those polls about the percentage of people who thought that the British Empire was a great enterprise. They didn't surprise me for these reasons. First of all, the British education system does not teach children that Britain was committing crimes against humanity in Africa, in the Caribbean, in India, or anywhere else. It teaches the glory of the British Empire, the spread of the British Empire. It puts people like Cecil Rhodes on a pedestal, and therefore you have to relearn history, which is not easy, before you understand the real horrors of the British Empire. Secondly, I think there was a psychology at work here. Someone, I think it was American Secretary of State, said Britain has lost an empire, but has not found a role. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. People hark back to the old empire. They still intervene where they shouldn't, like in Iraq and Libya and places, trying to think that they are the world's big power. And there is, I think, going to develop in this new century a different understanding, I hope, of what Britain's role positively can be. Because the third phenomenon is that I believe British politics is undergoing change. I know the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, very well. I campaigned with him on many platforms. He's a man of principle. He will face intolerable pressures, but he certainly would wish to do the right thing. He even did his community service when he was a young man in Jamaica. And there are people around him of a similar leaning. What I'm saying is, never think that everything is unchangeable. The power of justice can change even the hardest of hearts. And I think the whole struggle of and victory against apartheid showed that. But it needs to be not just carried on by leaders, it needs to be carried on with the support of people. So I think that Britain will change. The second question I was asked was about the petition and the law. In 1833, there was an act passed called the Judicial Committee Act. Section 3 of it provided for appeals to go to Her Majesty's Privy Council against decisions made by the highest appeal courts in the different colonies and dominions. And we still have that. I don't agree with it. I think we should go to the CCJ, but that's another issue. We still have that right of appeal to the Privy Council. Section 4, which next follows of the 1833 Act, says that Her Majesty may refer any other matter to the Privy Council, who shall investigate it and advise her. And therefore there is a jurisdiction in the Privy Council to take any matter of which the crime against humanity, which of chattel slavery is one, to take any matter and deal with it and make recommendations and give advice as to what should be done in the way of an apology, reparative justice, and so on. But I do say, and I speak as a lawyer, justice doesn't come just falling down from the trees for you to grasp. Justice has to be fought for. So the mere fact that there is a petition doesn't mean that the petition will win. It has to be supported by not only legal minds, but people's minds, both in Britain and here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I can summarize, that's precisely where I've reached. And it's precisely the path that I'm pursuing. So I now have the British legal opinion on the matter and how to pursue it, and the way that will be done. And the basic point of getting a political decision is that a singular citizen can pursue this through the International Court of Justice once a political decision has been taken by your country. So the options are there, and the courts are there. And I still believe that the aspect of right over wrong will ultimately, in terms of it, impact on where we want to go. That's where I'm pursuing and asking for all the support that relates to that overall.
Thank you. And we have one question here. Are there any other questions in the room? Two questions nationwide. Stephen Golding, and one more. Okay, those will be the three, and then we have to wrap up. Yes, Stephen.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
I understand in terms of petitions and in terms of the call for reparation and the legal pursuits we're taking, but I want to ask to the VC and to Minister Henry, given the information that we are gathering, even through the Center for Reparations Research, and the insulting nature of what we're finding out, what is preventing those governments of countries that have come down from the institution of slavery from taking direct action while we're waiting on the negotiation and the legal? And for example, we have a list of countries that we know participated. Why not put a reparations tax on members of those countries coming into these islands directly, because we know what country they'll be coming from? One. Two, if we have a list of companies that we know benefited, then why are our governments not putting some sort of reparation tax on those companies that are operating in our country? Is it one, that we are not confident in our brand as a destination? Or two, is it that we lack the political will? Is it that our politicians, our leaders, our prime ministers are not as insulted as we are, and are not taking seriously the fact that there are actions that we can take without waiting for Europe to come to the table?
Okay, let me take the question from Ms. Turner Thomas, nationwide, and then the social media question, and then the panelists will close off.
I wanted to find out if any Prime Minister, British Prime Minister in recent time, is it that any of the companies to which their families belonged benefited from the compensation? And if so, do we have the names?
It's in the kit. Is this in the kit?
Sure. Yeah, Prime Minister. Yeah. Julie, could you just find it for us? Okay, and the social media?
It was mentioned that the Caribbean's economy will... It was mentioned that the Caribbean's economy will not go forward if monies are not returned. Is reparations therefore the only way that the Caribbean can truly achieve economic growth? If not reparations, then what is Plan B?
All right, so Chair of CRC, would you like to take, I think most of the questions addressed to you, actually.
Well, I don't think... sorry, go ahead.
The quest for reparations and social justice has been ongoing for hundreds of years. From the moment these crimes were committed, the African peoples, in one way or another, have been asking for reparatory justice. If you go through, for example, the discussion in the British Parliament and the build-up to the Emancipation Act, the enslaved Africans in the Caribbean were saying, how about us? Where is our reparations? If you go through those minutes and those reports, the British government actually said, no, we are taking your case off the table. The enslaved had actually put their case on the table. That case was taken off. And the British government decided, your reparations is the fact that we're freeing you. That was the response of the British government to the claim in the first round. Insult one. But also to remember, I'm going through step by step, give me a little patience with me. The Emancipation Act was the most racist act ever passed in the British Parliament, or arguably in any parliament. Why was the Emancipation Act a vile and racist piece of legislation? Because the act said that we are going to recognize you as property, because the only way they could pay the compensation to the slave owners was first to recognize that the Africans were not humans and that they were property, and that the government was taking people's property away from them and therefore have to compensate the people for taking away their property. So the act begins with an acknowledgement that, first of all, these 600,000 black people in the Caribbean are not human beings. They are no different from horse, cow, sheep, land. They are property. So if an act begins like that and then proceeds to say, then you work for free for another 6 years, the act itself, philosophically, legally, was a vile and racist piece of legislation. But they had to do it in order to pay themselves the compensation. They had to, first of all, define black people as non-human and property, then to get to the position to say, what is their worth? 47 million pounds? Well, we're going to pay compensation market value. That's the first thing. The question now is, how has this movement morphed? I do not believe there's any one compelling argument. The reparatory justice movement has always been based on a multiplicity of arguments and strategies. It's a huge tent in which everyone has a role to play. So there will be different routes, different arguments, different strategies. We have to accept them all. What the governments have said of late in establishing the commission is that we are going to formally write to the governments of Europe and call for a summit to discuss this matter and the way forward. No different from the summits that were held to discuss independence. The same way independence built up, and we had a conference in London, Lancaster House, to discuss the way forward, they have determined that this is the first step they're going to take. They have also determined that if the political and diplomatic approach does not work, they are going to use the legal systems available in the international community. That does not mean that groups, persons, individuals cannot pursue their own agendas and strategies. On the contrary, it's an open field, many tributaries moving into the river. The question about whether reparatory justice is going to be a financial panacea, the answer is obviously not. Development is a broad-based process of transformation. What we are saying in this particular piece of it, that there is a debt that has to be paid. In 1938, the first Vice Chancellor of this university, Sir Arthur Lewis, wrote in 1938, this debt has to be paid. This debt owed by the British government to the people of the Caribbean must be paid, and it is necessary to fund the integration movement. It is necessary to fund transformation. It is necessary to push development. It is not the only path. It is one of the strategies. My final point would be this. Yesterday was Social Justice Day. Yesterday was International Social Justice Day. And I felt very proud of this university yesterday in taking a very big and bold decision. Our oldest student dormitory, 1927, at the St. Augustine campus, Milner Hall, and many of you have probably have friends who have stayed in Milner Hall. Milner Hall was named after Lord Alfred Milner, who was the governor of the Transvaal in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century. He was the one who led the war against the Zulus. He was the one who committed crimes against humanity in South Africa, defined the African peoples as savages, and led the British Army against them. But yet we had a dormitory named after him, because he had determined that the future of the British Empire will depend upon whether Britain can produce white farmers, and white farmers need to know how to farm in the tropics, so that when the British Army captures land in Africa, Australia, and other places, the white farmers will go and take the land and build communities. And so he funded the School for Tropical Agriculture at Trinidad. And they built the Institute for Tropical Agriculture in Trinidad. That institute became a part of UWI. And that dormitory that was built in 1927 was pulled into UWI and remained unnamed because people had forgotten the history. And this hall had been there with Lord Alfred Milner, a man who is wanted in South Africa for crimes against humanity, but in UWI, a university built on justice. His name was up there, Lord Milner Hall. I was so proud yesterday when the students at the St. Augustine campus, the academics at St. Augustine campus, unanimously agreed that after 90 years, Lord Alfred Milner's name must be removed from the University of the West Indies, and proposed instead that that dormitory, as from tomorrow morning, will be named Freedom Hall. It was a major decision. As from tomorrow, that hall will now be called Freedom Hall. And Lord Alfred Milner, who has committed these crimes in South Africa against the ordinary people, and who has written a book describing himself as a white supremacist, is removed from the environment of the University of the West Indies. And those students tomorrow, when they walk into the dormitory, will now be walking into Freedom Hall. That was a very important decision. I want to say this to you. As Lord Gifford says, the struggle always appears hard. But what history teaches is that the impossible suddenly becomes very possible. Overnight, the impossible becomes possible because history shifts. It might move slowly, but suddenly, for a reason we don't quite understand, it shifts in the other direction, and it shifts aggressively and swiftly. That's why you have to stay the course. Thank you.
Thank you. And just for Ms. Thomas, I think Prime Minister Cameron, and I think the chair of CARICOM Reparation Commission has written it in his book, Britain's Black Debt. As far as we know, the PM Cameron's family had an interest in Grange Plantation in Jamaica.
Orange Grange?
And therefore would have had an interest in the compensation money.
Yes.
I think it's Hanover.
Orange Grange Plantation.
Yes.
Lord Duff, Sir
Right.
Lord Duff, who owned 202 Africans on Orange Grange Estate. That was the estate that provided the compensation. They received £1.4 million in 1834. All of that passed all the way down, trickled down to the Prime Minister. Yes.
Okay, so we'll have to wrap up. Your final point, you have a final point?
Not really, just
Okay.
that the only issue I'd have to say is how important land is in all of this. And we must remember we were prevented from voting if you didn't own any land. And therefore, if all of the transitions that we have heard of proves the point that this was an intended area of development to keep us where we are.
And then put the reparations tax on them. We can do it.
Well,
We will make the proposal when we next meet in the council.
no,
Okay.
I think I'm close to where I'm exactly going. I want to win where I can win.
Okay. And Lord Anthony Gifford, a closing remark?
There's no magic legal action you can take. I think we've chosen the most promising avenue so far with the petition. In answer to the question whether it's reparations or failure, I don't see it that way. I see the struggle for reparations, in fact, as a way of building our own confidence and our own strength. There's a big internal debate to be held. I sometimes say that the first stage of the reparations struggle is finishing, that is to make the case for reparations. The second stage is to define what is reparations, what is reparatory justice, And I think that debate again can lift us, engage us, involve our scholars and our people. And so I don't see that the fact of claiming reparations means that if you don't get what you want, somehow you completely failed.
Thank you very much. My thanks to all of you for attending this press conference hosted by the Center for Reparation Research at the University of the West Indies. My thanks to the panelists, my thanks to the staff of the Vice Chancellor's Office, Minister Henry, Lord Anthony Gifford, the staff of the Center for Reparation Research, Jodian Quarry, our research assistant, who also is an international human rights lawyer, Mr. Floyd Williams, our efficient admin assistant, and our student volunteer from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Shafiq Sam over there, a good student of reparation based on where he's located. And of course, I thank the media and communication arm of the UWI. I thank Ms. Marcia Erskine, Mr. Don Rojas, UWI TV, the CIO, facilities, maintenance, security, the service staff, and just everyone who pitched in. We have provided some liquid refreshment for you downstairs. Jodian will lead you there should you need. So thank you all very much. We look forward to great stories from the media, and we look forward to the continuation of this discussion in the public eye. And we, of course, will continue our research and advocacy. Thank you very much.